So the first thing that I would like to talk about is my own personal testimony, my experience. And it's not because it's so important. Hopefully it's not all that different. Well, it will be probably different from most of you in some very important ways. But it's a story that is different, and yet it's the same because it's about finding truth, finding out who the real important person in this world is. I like to, when I teach students, I teach at Faith Builders, for those of you that don't know that, and I like to let my students know a little bit about me, because if you don't know about the person, you can't evaluate his teaching as well. So it's a really good thing, first of all, when you hear from a speaker, to know a little bit about him, but it's also, my testimony is very important as far as how I came to believe and hopefully practice non-resistance. I teach history and I teach theology, and as far as understanding both of those, getting a little bit of knowledge about the person who's telling the story is an important thing. So, first thing that I'd like to tell you is that I was born and raised in Maryland, and that is a relevant piece of information, I would say. My background is Catholic, and my people would have come over here before any of yours in the very, very early 1600s, because they were being persecuted in England. They were Catholics, and England had become a Protestant country, and anyone who resisted that change was then persecuted by the government, and the Catholics went underground. So the same thing was happening in other places. Of course, this is our story as well in Europe on the continent. Our people were also persecuted and went underground, so to speak, in order to survive. But in the early 1600s, the King of England granted a piece of land called Maryland to one of his trusty aides who secretly wanted to be a Catholic and eventually did become a Catholic, and then he established the colony and helped those that were secretly Catholic to come over from England to the New World. My parents were committed Catholics, and just like many of us, they went the extra mile to send their children to Catholic school. So how many of you send your children to a day school, a Christian day school? Probably most of you, I would think, that have children anyway. And that's an extra, we pay the government taxes for the public school, but then we go that extra mile. Well, my parents did that too. And as I look back on that, I recognize that was a great, they were sacrificing for their children, to give them the kind of education that they thought would do them the best. So I come from a family of committed Catholics. Just to give you a little insight into what I really enjoyed the school. It's the Catholic school. It was they expected a lot out of you, discipline-wise and academics, and as far as those two things were concerned, and it was something that I really enjoyed. Just a little note to give you a feel for what it was like to be a Catholic in the 1960s. I don't know if this would still happen or not, but one day when I was walking off the ball field, going back to the classroom, I got knocked on the head with a softball. It didn't feel very soft, but anyway, knocked me out. And when I woke up, a nun was carrying me or dragging me into the school to take me to the infirmary. And when I saw that a nun was holding on to me, I fainted again, because this holy person was carrying me. That's the kind of sense. The nuns that taught us, they were holy people. And so that just gives you a little bit of a feel for what that was like. My dad at this time was a Maryland state trooper, and so that'll also give you a little bit of insight. He had been in the Navy when I was born. So I was born at the Bethesda Naval Hospital. It's just a little bit of background. My dad, has always, the jobs he's had, they were always about defending people with guns, whether it's in the military or whether it was with the Maryland State Police. So that gives you a sense for my early life, I think. I really did enjoy the history even in my early years. I was very intrigued by the fact that Maryland had been settled because of persecution. So that was something I was really aware of, that my people had cared that much about their faith that they were willing to suffer in England and then travel across the ocean. It was very unsafe back then, and come to the New World. So that had a large impact on me. But when I was about 11 or so, I'm not exactly sure, 11, 12, something happened, and I just want to tell you about this because it might be a different thing than what you would expect in a Catholic setting. But we actually had some very good teaching, and I knew that I was a sinner, and I knew that Jesus died on the cross for me, and that was the only cure for sin. I knew that. We were taught that. And one day, like I said, I'm not sure, I was somewhere between 11 and 13, I think, or maybe even a little younger, I can't remember. Out on the playground, I just felt terrifically moved to go into the church, which was right next door to the school, and in front of a crucifix, I knelt down and I just cried, and I said to Jesus, I know you're on that cross because of me. I'm saying this just to indicate that there was a lot of truth being taught there, and I understood that. Now, there's also something missing there, and I'll just leave it at that for this moment. But anyway, as time went on, my dad got a job, a transfer. He was still a state trooper. My father got a transfer to Western Maryland, and there was no Catholic school there, at least not nearby. And so my parents actually really put out a lot of effort to get the school that was closest to run a bus into the northern part of the county where we lived and pick up the Catholic children that were there and bring them down to the southern part of the county. And the school didn't think they could do that, and so it never happened. And so after that transfer, I ended up in public school, which was a shock to me. I was a good little boy in the Catholic school, and you just did what they said. And I come to this public school, and it took me about 3 or 4 years before I could break the rules and chew gum and things like that. I just wasn't used to something quite like that. But anyway, it was a very interesting and a very important part, I think, of my experience. I got to know people from outside of my own circle, my Catholic circles, and so I think that was a good thing for me. Also, at this time, I would be a teenager now when we moved to the western part of the state. I think an awful lot of us, when we get to be teenagers, we start to question a whole lot of things. And I started to question my religious heritage. And as time went on, you're also having these struggles with who are you? What does it mean to be going from being a boy to being a man? And those kinds of things were happening. I was having some struggles with that, lots of questions. And I started to question my religious heritage. And I was actually at the place, probably when I was 16 or so, that I said to myself, when I'm old enough, I'm just going to quit going to church. This just doesn't make any sense to me. And but my family was going to church, and at that age, I was going to do what they were still doing, what was important to them. And so I had a period of time where I went away from that good teaching that I had, and just was living for myself in selfishness. So I was giving up that good background. I was giving up a lot of positive things. But I also did have the background was there, and I had some good friends. As I went into public school, I actually got to know some Mennonite and Beachy Amish young people at the high school. And so there were some things that were still holding me or pulling me in the right direction. And so that's important to recognize. When I look back and think about all of this, I just wonder where I might have ended up if I hadn't left the Catholic school system. I don't know. I don't know what would have happened there. But anyway, as I was in this situation of being in a state of confusion, a state of flux, unsure about what I believed, wanting to abandon what I had been taught, something sort of interesting happened. I had a fellow classmate who was a big athlete on the football team. I was never an athlete, so that wasn't necessarily a big plus in my mind, but he was an athlete. He belonged to a church that was very evangelistic, and he would witness to people like me, and but he would do it in some. It struck me very strange. He would use less than good language, even when he was testifying to you. But that was just part of his life. And I don't remember now how I knew this, but I knew that he didn't like blacks. And one day he said to me, "Oh, we're having a revival meeting at church, and I'd really like you to go." And he told me who's coming, and I think he just said, it just kind of came out that this is a black preacher from Philadelphia. And I think that might have been the main thing that kind of tickled my interest is, here, this fella, I can use his first name because nobody here would ever know. No, I better not. I think that's what attracted me to go, because I knew that he would be the kind of person that probably wouldn't want to live next to a black person. And so I went. And, what I heard preached wasn't significantly different. Do you remember what I said about when I went to the Catholic church during recess at the Catholic school? And I knelt down overwhelmed with the fact that Jesus was on that cross and he died for me, and that this is the satisfaction for my sins. I knew that. I was taught that as a good Catholic. But there was something else that happened when at this revival service. And the minister said, "You've got to make that part of your own life personally." And that would be the difference. In the Catholic setting, I'm not saying no Catholic makes what Jesus did for him part of his life personally, but their emphasis is on receiving grace through the sacraments. So being baptized and receiving communion. But they would tell you that the reason they can receive that grace is because of Jesus' death and resurrection. So I had this background, and then I hear, but I have to give my life to Christ. And I did that evening. You can visualize this. I went forward, and I confessed my sins, and I told Jesus that I wanted him to be my Lord. And when any of us does that, very specific things happen. And it depends on who it is that opened his life to Christ. And you can do it in different ways. You can do it at home. You can do it at church. That part doesn't matter. You might go forward. You might not. Those things don't matter. But when you give your life to Christ, he's going to do something in your life that you need to have done. I would say that I had a very specific need at this point in time. This is right towards the end of the Vietnam War. I was actually in the last draft. I wasn't drafted. My number was low, but I wasn't drafted. But this was during the Vietnam War days. That was towards the end of the war. And now think about it. My dad had been a sailor. He was now a state trooper. And probably at least partly because of that, I was pretty nationalistic. And so one of the things that the Lord felt that he needed to deal with as far as this particular person is concerned was that area of perhaps having my country in the place that God ought to be in my heart. And so when I left that church, I don't know if I recognized it fully that day or if it was the next morning, but I recognized two things. And one was that here I was, a young man facing the draft and figuring I probably will go into the military and need to fight. So the next day, I realized very clearly that a Christian doesn't kill. I think God put his finger on that particular thing. Now, it wasn't as clear to me at that point what that fully meant as it has become in the days that followed. But that was the one thing that I just knew. I knew that I couldn't harm another person. I shouldn't harm another person. Let's put it that way. Even we Christians can sometimes go our own way and do things that we shouldn't. But I knew that God is calling all of us Christians to a life of peace and reconciliation, not forcing other people to do things the way that we think they should. The other thing was, I really wanted to serve God. So those were the two things. Now, with my background, what do you think that meant that I wanted to serve God? By the way, I teach at Faith Builders, so if I ask a question, I'm stuck until you answer. So what? Just off the cuff, what do you think it meant with all the background? I didn't give you a lot of stuff, but I gave you enough, I think. What do you think it would mean for a young man like I was? I was 17, and I recognized a Christian doesn't harm others, and also I want to serve God. What do you think that meant maybe for my life? Pardon? You're right. I felt that I wanted to become a priest. And so that leads off to another little trail in my life. I'm the first person in my family that went to college. My parents felt that college was necessary to advance, so they were putting pressure on, you need to go to college. And I graduated when I was 17, so all this stuff is happening in my senior year. So anyway, I wanted to serve the Lord, so I told my parents, I want to become a priest. I want to serve the Lord that way. And they were kind of shocked. And I don't know what the priest thought in our church, because this is shameful, but as a teenager who was drifting away from the faith, but still was going to church because his family was going, and I don't think I would have been given the option of not going. Sometimes when the priest would say something in his sermon I didn't like, I would kind of frown and do this. And I don't know if he ever saw it or not. But I did that. And here this guy that did that comes to him one day and says, I want to become a priest. What do I do? So I don't know if he didn't say anything to me, but I often wondered since then if he had ever noticed my frowning and shaking my head. But anyway, he gave me information. I wrote to the bishop, and I told him that I felt called to become a priest. And they lost my letter. This is, so we weren't hearing anything back from them. And if you remember, my parents, and I think especially my mother, was putting pressure on, you need to go to college. And the bishop hasn't written back to you or called you, so you need to go to college. There's a new community college down the road, 15 minutes. You should apply there. So finally I did. And I was accepted, and I got a grant. That's always nice. So it was going to cost me less money than it might otherwise. And right at this time, just before it's time to start going to school, I got a letter from the bishop. And he told me, we lost your letter, and we just found it. And of course, you can come to seminary. Well, I wrote back and said, well, I'm at the local community college now, so I'll just stay there and then come after 2 years. So that's what I did. It was a very interesting experience for me because this is a This is Garrett County for anybody who might know that. It's in western Maryland. It's very rural. It's changing, but back then it was very rural. And most of the people there would go to church. And I went to this community college in its first year. So it was a small group of students, but they were almost all local. And most of them were Christians. And so we, in a way, had for 2 years a youth group, a Christian youth group there. It was just like that. And, it was wonderful. Did a lot of Bible studies together. When we talked, often we talked about God. And they were intrigued that I was thinking about becoming a priest. And so it was a really very good experience. Of course, I was going to the Catholic Church, and I was helping out now instead of shaking my head against the priest's sermons. And during that 2 years, if any of you want to become a priest, you will write to the local Catholic bishop, and he will appoint what's called a Vocations Director, and that's a priest who then gets to know you and sense what your needs might be, what your spiritual needs might be, and starts to direct your life as far as its spiritual aspect is concerned. Well, I did, during those 2 years, have a vocations director, and we met often. I don't remember how often. Over that time period, he decided I was too conservative. I need to be rounded out. He didn't tell me this. I found it out later from my dad. So he starts to direct me towards a certain seminary. I was clueless. I didn't know if there were even any options. And I went to a seminary in Baltimore City, which was pretty liberal. This would be the early and middle 70s, the time period I'm talking about. And so after my first 2 years of college at the community college, I went to Baltimore, and I started attending what's called a seminary college. There's sort of two steps. You go to seminary college, and then you go to a seminary graduate school if you want to become a priest. So I went to this school, and I was floored. It was just so different than what I believed and what I was expecting. It really did have a liberal bias to it. And after one semester, I was not able to continue there. I was thoroughly disillusioned. I was depressed, in fact. And I went home after the first semester and just did not go back. And for a while, I didn't do much of anything. I just stayed at home. Because I was depressed. And the reason I was depressed was when I gave my life to the Lord, everything seemed so clear. God wants us to be reconcilers, not people that harm others. That was so clear. And that's not the issue, though. And the other thing that was so clear, I thought I had this path in front of me to serve God by becoming a priest. And that seemed to disappear. And what do you do at a moment like that? Well, I didn't know what to do for a while. Like I said, for a while I didn't even get a job. I just was discouraged. But I did have a lot of friends in that community. I had even Mennonite and Beachy friends from high school, and I had those friends from community college, and most of those were Christian people. So after a while, I started talking to them and telling them about what happened. It looks like I lost my pathway, and I told them some of the questions that came up in my mind while I was at the seminary, some of the questions that came because of the liberal teaching that I was hearing. And most of the people that I was talking to weren't Catholic, and some of the things just sounded very strange to them, and they didn't really know exactly how to help me. But there was one friend from the Beachy Church. He didn't exactly know how to help me either, perhaps, but he could listen very well, and that really made a difference. One friend of mine told me, "Why do you let these things bother you?" Well, they did. Regardless of why I let them bother me, they did. And the fact that this fellow would listen to me and interact and ask me more questions, it helped me to get a little bit better grasp on the whole thing. Then one day, I went back to the community college, to the library, and I was looking at the books on a shelf, and I think I was specifically thinking about what to do as far as my faith is concerned. And so I was in a section that had books on religion, and I saw a book on the history of the Reformation. So I pulled it down, and I started looking at the various chapters, and so one chapter tells you about the Lutherans, one chapter tells you about the Calvinists, and then I think it was right after that there's a chapter on the Anabaptists. And I'm not quite sure if I knew at that point that my Beachy friends and my Mennonite friends were Anabaptists. I'm not quite sure if I knew that. But I looked at this and I started reading this chapter, and it was very interesting. I didn't have to get even past the first paragraph, and I was just I found something that was very significant in my life. The first paragraph said something like this: the Anabaptists were another group of Protestants, but they differed with the rest of the Protestants on 5 points. I think it said 5 points. And then it named them and described them a little bit. And I think two that were really significant for me were, it mentioned the priesthood of the believers. They practiced the priesthood of the believers. And the other thing was it mentioned non-resistance, and then it explained what that meant. And I read this and I said, wow, this is what I believe, only better. Because I had been moving ahead in my thinking about what it means that I don't, as a Christian, don't harm someone, but I didn't really fully understand that. For instance, I was in the last draft, and I wondered, what should I do as a person that knows he can't kill someone? And I decided, well, we love our country, we obey the laws. If my number comes up, then I go into the Army, but I just won't shoot anybody. Well, that's the kind of place I was. I didn't fully know how to think through some of these ideas. And then in this book, it gave a better description, it gave a fuller description of what this ought to mean if you really are a non-resistant person, something much clearer than I had up to that point. And whether I knew it as I began into that chapter, I eventually realized, oh, these people are my Beachy and Mennonite friends. And so that summer, I started attending the Beachy church. I think, I'm a little bit hazy here, but I think I started to go during Vacation Bible School. So I went to church on Sunday, and then they had Vacation Bible School, so I went to church Sunday night and Monday night. It was either the second or third night. I was standing next to one of the ministers as we were dismissing. So once we were done, I was feeling kind of impressed. And once we were done, I turned to the minister and I said, how do you join this church? What do you think he said to me? Anybody? I'm wondering what you would say. How many of you are ministers? Okay, what would you say to me? What would you say to me? You didn't know me before. You saw me Sunday, Monday, and Tuesday. Well, the next thing he did was he said, well, maybe you should come to church a little longer. He didn't know my background. I did know some people there, but I really didn't know all the ins and outs, what this really meant. And so he suggested maybe I should come to church a little longer and go to the instruction class. They were having an instruction class at that point. So I got in on the tail end of the instruction class, and don't have to make this too long, but they didn't know what to do with me because they were just getting to know me. They only heard in the instruction class some of what I believed, and so they baptized the instruction class, and they said what they'd like is for me to go around and talk to all the ministers, and then they'll decide how to proceed. And I did that, and they said, well, your faith is like our faith. From my reading, from the development that happened during the time that I was at community college, and then especially that book just really crystallized things for me. So the book on the history of the Reformation. So after a while, they decided, I essentially believe the same thing, and I was baptized a little bit later. into the church. And that was a very important moment for me. I was back in college at that point, but I dropped out, not because they said I should, but because I just wanted to focus my energy on learning more about what's this all about and becoming part of it. This was the Mountain View congregation where the mountain anthems are from, so I spent time singing with the mountain anthems and doing things like that. Well, that would have been, I was baptized in October of 1974, and my first 6 years I spent time teaching in our Christian day schools. I taught school there in Maryland, and I also taught in Arthur, Illinois. And then there was a little break. I did some mission work in Germany, and then I taught one more year in Lancaster. So those first couple of years I spent time teaching. I was in different communities, and eventually I got into a VS position with Choice Books, and ended up getting hired after my VS time there was done. And so I spent from about 1981 to 1999 at Choice Books, working with them and being a part of the congregation there in Catlett, Virginia. Over time, I started to get a little bit shaken. I think in my late 20s or maybe early 30s, late 20s, I started to realize that a lot of the young men my age were dissatisfied with the very things that I sort of liked and that I found positive. And that shook me up a bit. What's going on here? Why do I feel this way and they feel that way? So one of the things that I did was partly for that reason and for the fact that I also by that point in time was feeling a little bit rusty in my mind, I decided to go back and finish college. And I went to a state university very close to where I lived, and I thought I was sensing that God wanted me to go to school, finish school, and that He was going to use that in some way. But I also had this question, why am I seeing my church setting differently than some people that were raised in it? And so out of that, I ended up after college, I went to what's called grad school at Wheaton in Illinois. And I went there with a couple of questions, about 5 questions, that I wanted to answer. And they were meant to help me realize, okay, am I at the right place or not? So I went to this Christian school, definitely not an Anabaptist school, and I looked into these issues, these questions that were coming up. And after a couple years, I came back home to Catlett. I was a convinced Anabaptist. I had thought it through. I had looked at the historical aspects, looked at the biblical aspects, and I felt that this is indeed a clear representation of what the Bible is about. I'm not saying that we don't have any problems. I'm not saying that we got it all nailed down. But as far as I'm concerned, this looks like it's the best thing I had found up to that point. And so I came back and very convinced this is the truth. A few years after that, the first Gulf War happened, and I was a little bit surprised. I've written a book about non-resistance, and if any of you read it, it starts out with how the first Gulf War started. And I was living with my mom at the time, and we actually saw it starting on CNN. We were looking at that when it actually happened, and that was a Tuesday or Wednesday, I believe. And the next Sunday, I went to church, and I was so surprised. After church, I was still in the youth group, so I was sitting up there with the young men, and after church, several of the guys were saying, "Did you see what our missiles can do?" And that, I don't know what that would do to you, but that shook me up a bit. Those are our missiles? I didn't quite think of it. I know I'm an American. And so maybe in that sense they are. But it felt like there was a little bit more possession there than just I'm an American, that's the American Army, And did you see what they can do? There was they were just very intrigued by the whole thing. And I have to admit, it was, I didn't know that the things that were, the kinds of weapons that had been developed. I didn't know that. So there was something startling about it. But I was startled by what felt to me like an overly powerful and strong connection or identification with the American military. And that caused me to use the education that I did have about church history to come up with a series of talks on church history, specifically on non-resistance. What was the church like at the beginning? We're going to talk about this in one of the lectures, so I'll get into that. But what did the church like at the beginning look like as far as non-resistance is concerned at the beginning? How did it change? How did it come back to non-resistance? Things like that. And I thought, surely we know that it's wrong to go to war, and the confusion more comes from, well, I have a neighbor down the street who says he's a Christian, and he says we ought to fight. And I have another neighbor that says, well, it's not good, but we need to fight, who's also a Christian. So I thought if I could tell them a little bit about the history and they could see how these different ideas came to be, maybe it would solidify what they already know in their heart, that a Christian shouldn't do this. By the way, I freely admit, and in fact insist, non-resistance is much, much, much more than you don't go to war. But especially historically, that's the kind of thing that is easiest. First of all, it's the biggest thing. I mean, killing people, that's bigger than suing them. So it's the biggest thing. And secondly, it's the thing you can identify the easiest historically. You can identify a few other things, but this is the trail, I think, that you have to follow if you want to see how the church lost the wholeness of non-resistance and then how they regained it. You have to focus, at least early on, more on whether the church what it thought about the military and going to war. I came up with this series of talks. I used it at a few places, but still I felt like the call that I thought I had sensed to serve the church after I had gone through college and grad school, I felt that wasn't happening, and I didn't know what that meant. Well, at the end of the 1990s, I got a call to consider coming to work at Faith Builders, and I did that. And I've been there since 1990, and I feel like that is what God was calling me to. I also feel, I didn't tell you this, but one of the reasons I mentioned the priesthood of the believers when I looked into that history of the Reformation book was I had felt this strong call from God to become, to serve him as a priest. And as I discovered I already was a priest. And so I just had to be serving him. I didn't need to have somebody make me a priest. I already was. And in fact, all of you are. And that's really a very important aspect of what it means to be a Christian. It took 9 years. I finished college and then had to wait about 9 years before Faith Builders gave me the opportunity to go up there and teach. Well, anyway, at Faith Builders, there was another Gulf War. A second Gulf War occurred when President Bush invaded Iraq. And I really sensed deeply, again, that God was saying, do something. And it was very specific. But it was something I've never felt called to. I felt that God was saying, write a book on non-resistance. My best friend is Steve Brubaker. He also works at Faith Builders. Years ago, he told me, we need more people writing books. We need more conservative Anabaptists writing books. And he said, you should write a book. And I said, well, I don't feel that's my calling. I don't sense that's my skill. But all of a sudden, when this second war erupted, it very powerfully on the inside, I felt this urge, I should do this, I should try this. And so I don't think it was from me. I really think it was from God, because I never ever thought that I would do something like write a book. I went to Steve. At that point, he was my boss, and I asked him, can I have a half a year off, because I don't think I could do this while I'm teaching. And he said, well, we'll think about it. I think it'll probably work out. We'll think about it. He and I were the only two people that knew this. Nobody else under the sun knew this. Well, a little bit after I talked to him, I get a call from a friend and former student at Faith Builders, Donovan Graber from Indiana. And he said, Steve, I want to go to Israel to learn Hebrew. See, he already knew Greek, and he likes reading the New Testament in Greek, and he wanted to learn Hebrew so he could read the Old Testament in Hebrew. He's really committed to God's Word that way. And he said, but my parents don't want me to go by myself. Would you go along? And I said, when is this? And how long? Guess what? It was exactly a half a year, and it was exactly the half a year that I was asking for off. And so I felt like, well, and my boss did say, yes, you can have the half year off. And I felt like God said, since you're willing to give it a try to write a book that's just something you never thought you'd do, I'm going to give you a little bonus, and you can go to Israel while you're there. So anyway, the two of us went to Israel, had a really good time there. He learned Hebrew. He went back for CAM. He lives there now. I spent that half month thinking and walking and typing and retyping and eventually writing a book about non-resistance. And it has both a historical side and it has a biblical side, the theological side, why this is truly what God expects. One of the reasons, I didn't quite state this as clearly as I should have, when that second Gulf War happened, I saw that there's still an awful lot of excitement. And I know it's okay to want to know what's happening and all those kinds of things. It's not that, but there seemed once again, a little bit too much of a connection, too much of a this is us as far as what the American military is doing. And so that was, I think, part of where this drive came to write a book. And once again, I think it was the Lord pushing me to do that. Right now, the book that I wrote is out of print, and we're working on a second edition. So I hope to add a little bit. It's been 10 years since I wrote it. I hope to add a little bit about some issues that have transpired over those 10 years. But my belief in non-resistance hasn't faltered a bit. I am absolutely convinced this is what God wants of all of his people. And I really think that it's one of the things God wants us to talk to other Christians about. Not necessarily questioning whether they're believers or not, but have they really seen the full implication of what it means to be a follower of the Lamb? And somehow we put non-resistance maybe on the side, or it's our kind of special thing. I think that's incorrect.